Hey there, welcome back to another peaceful evening together. Tonight, we're slipping into a story wrapped in soft memories and the quiet ache of what once was. It's about George, an elderly man who visits the same weathered bench in Linden Park every Thursday, the very spot where he and Clara used to sit, sipping strawberry sodas and dreaming about the future. Time moved on, as it always does, and so did Clara. But George never stopped returning to that bench, and never stopped wondering, what if? Before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the quiet world we share here. And if you feel like it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always comforting to see who's gathered here with us tonight. Now, dim the lights, let the hush of evening settle around you, and if there's a soft breeze or a gentle hum nearby, let it be part of this moment. Let's drift into tonight's story about youth, love, and the memories that sit beside us long after the people have gone. Every Thursday, just after the town clock chimed 3, George arrived at Linden Park. He didn't need a watch to know the time. He knew by the feel of the air, the position of the sun, and the way the light slanted gently across the path lined with silver birches. The park barely changed over the years. A few more trees, a different swing set, but the bench stayed the same. Worn, wooden, and curved just slightly from decades of conversation. It sat beneath a towering maple tree, whose roots had begun to lift the brick path ever so slightly, as if the earth itself were straining to hear the stories whispered there. George eased down slowly, his bones creaking in protest, and placed his brown hat beside him. A thermos of tea, a small paper bag from the bakery, and a folded handkerchief sat in his lap. He looked out across the pond, watched the ducks glide in gentle arcs, and took a long breath. Here, on this bench, he had once shared strawberry sodas and college dreams with Clara. That was a long time ago, but memory was a faithful thing. He still came every Thursday, rain or shine, summer or snow. It wasn't just habit, it was a ritual. Sometimes he'd bring a book. Sometimes he'd just sit and let the breeze carry old laughter back to him. The kind of laughter you don't forget, because it lives inside the person who once looked at you like you hung the stars. Clara. She had been everything. Not in a grand, sweeping way, but in the quiet, complete way that meant you'd never feel fully alone again, until you did. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old photograph. Faded, edges curled, the corners soft from years of unfolding. Her smile hadn't aged. It never would. He looked at it and smiled back. "You'd still make fun of my socks," he murmured aloud. A young couple passed by, hand in hand. The girl leaned her head on the boy's shoulder, and George's eyes softened. He didn't envy them. He simply remembered. He remembered the way Clara would swing her legs when she sat, just a little, like she couldn't contain the energy of her spirit. He remembered how she used to say, "Always strawberry, never chocolate," and how she scrunched her nose when he made bad puns. This bench had heard it all. First confessions, quiet dreams, the occasional silence that said more than any word could. And now it heard only the leaves and the birds and the steady rhythm of an old man who still made space for love. George sipped his tea, unwrapped the warm bread roll, and let the Thursday unfold. Because even though time had moved on, his heart had not. And this bench, this park, this hour, they were still hers. Still theirs. Every Thursday, just like always. The strawberry sodas came from a little corner shop, just down the road from Linden Park. They weren't fancy syrup from a pump, fizzy water, a paper straw, but to George and Clara, they were summer in a glass. The kind of sweetness that made the whole world slow down. He could still remember the first time they sat on the bench together. They'd both been students at the nearby college, thrown together during a group project on American literature. Clara had opinions sharp, passionate, beautiful ones, and George had fallen in love somewhere between her defense of Emily Dickinson and the way she tapped her pen against her lip when she was thinking. "Let's go get something cold," she'd said one afternoon after class, the sun blazing above the chapel roof. "I'm craving something pink and unreasonable." He laughed then, and still did now, recalling the way she took his hand without asking and walked straight toward the park like it had been waiting for them. That first soda had turned into many. Thursdays became their day. A pocket of joy in the whirlwind of classes, part-time jobs, and vague post-graduation plans. They sat and talked for hours about books, music, and cities they wanted to live in, about what it would mean to be a writer, a teacher, a dreamer. George was going to study history. Clara was leaning toward journalism. "I want to tell stories," she said once, sipping her drink. "Real ones. The kind that reminds people they're not alone." "You'll be brilliant," he said. "You already are," she replied. And then they were quiet, because sometimes even the deepest connection doesn't need filling. It just needs space. George remembered how she used to draw little hearts on the condensation of her soda cup, or how she'd challenge him to guess her favorite line from a novel, laughing when he always got it wrong. They never kissed on that bench. Not at first. That came later, after the semester ended, and they found themselves walking through the park with no excuse to sit anymore, except for each other. It had been Clara who stopped, who turned, who looked up at him and said, "Are you ever going to kiss me, George Marshall? Or are you going to keep quoting dead poets at me?" He kissed her. Right there, with the sun setting through the maple leaves and the scent of soda and summer in the air. They were young. Too young to know that sometimes love doesn't get to be the end of the story, but old enough to know that what they had was real. On Thursday afternoons, the world felt still. They weren't worried about grades, or the future, or the fact that soon, life would begin asking harder questions. They just sat, with strawberry sodas, and dreams are too big to fit in anyone's life. They talked about living in Paris, about writing books and owning a bookstore with a cat who'd sit on the window display. They planned a trip to Italy. They promised always to have Thursdays. And even though none of those plans came true, they had been beautiful enough just to dream. George smiled as he remembered the time Clara convinced him to read his poetry at an open mic night, something utterly terrifying to him. "Be brave," she'd whispered backstage, squeezing his hand. "Your words matter, even if your knees shake." They did shake, but Clara had cheered louder than anyone. Afterward, she told him she'd never been prouder of anything, not even her A- in political theory. They weren't perfect. They had their squabbles. Clara was impulsive, while George tended to overthink. She once accused him of treating life like a chess game, always calculating 5 moves ahead. He said she jumped into puddles without checking how deep they were. But those differences didn't divide them. They taught each other balance. She showed him how to dance in the rain. He showed her how to find peace in the pause. And the bench? It became their safe place. It held their laughter, yes, but also their silences, their worries, their prayers. When Clara's father was hospitalized, they sat on that bench until the sun went down, her head resting on his shoulder, not saying much at all. And when George got accepted to a prestigious fellowship overseas, it was on that bench that they celebrated. And later, on that same bench, Clara grew quiet. "Do you think," she had asked slowly, "that some kinds of love are meant to shape you, not keep you?" He didn't know how to answer. Not then. "I just don't want us to hurt," she added. "But maybe that's part of it." They stayed longer than usual that day. Neither one wanted to go. George thought often about that conversation, about how young they were, yet how wise she had always been. They hadn't made any promises. There had been no official goodbye, just a long hug, a shared soda, and the sound of birds as they sat beneath the old maple tree one final time. After George left, they wrote for a while. Letters, postcards, little moments sent across oceans. But eventually, the letters slowed. Life moved. Clara stayed. George studied. Their paths forked quietly. Still, every time he thought of home, he thought of the bench, of her, of strawberry sodas and sunlight in her hair. It wasn't regret he felt, not entirely. It was reverence. Some loves, he'd come to understand, don't end with heartbreak. They just get folded into who you are. Like a favorite song you haven't heard in years, but still know all the words to. And every Thursday when he sat on that same bench, George didn't mourn what wasn't. He honored what had been. Because once, a long time ago, on a wooden bench beneath a maple tree, he had loved someone with his whole heart. And that, he knew, was enough. Years later, Clara married someone else. George had seen the announcement in the alumni newsletter. A small photo, a line of text. She looked radiant, confident, just as he remembered her. He never reached out. It hadn't felt right. But he kept the clipping in a book of poems she once gave him, pressed like a leaf from a past that still whispered now and then. He never stopped loving her, not in a longing way, but in the remembering way. She had been the season that taught him how to feel, how to give without holding on too tightly, how to cherish without needing to claim. That was the kind of love they had, a quiet one, a true one. And as he sat on the bench all these years later, with his thermos in the breeze, and the memory of strawberry soda sweetness still clinging to his lips, George closed his eyes and smiled. He had been loved, and he had loved. That was the dream. Not Paris. Not the bookstore. Not the map they once drew on a napkin with pins in every city they wanted to see. But her, Clara. George had never been good at endings. He was the kind of man who left rooms quietly, who lingered at train stations until the last whistle blew, hoping for a reason to stay. But life, he'd learned, rarely paused long enough for you to decide. Sometimes, it swept you forward before your heart could catch up. It had been spring when the letter arrived. Crisp envelope, the university's crest embossed in deep green. He'd been accepted into the overseas fellowship 1 year, all expenses paid, research under the finest minds in his field. It was everything he'd worked for. Clara was the first person he told. She had met him at the bench, holding 2 strawberry sodas like it was any other Thursday. When he showed her the letter, she read it twice, then looked up, smiling proudly, but eyes unreadable. "This is incredible, George," she said. Truly. But the smile didn't last. They didn't talk about what it meant. Not that day. They just sat in the sun, drinking soda, pretending like the clock wasn't ticking. It wasn't until a week later that she finally asked the question hanging between them. "When do you leave?" "August," he said. "They want me there before the fall term." She nodded slowly. "That's soon." He knew what she was asking. Not in words, but in the silence that followed. Was he going? And if he was, what did that mean for them? They had no ring, no plan, no promises made in candlelight. Just Thursdays, just sodas, just 1,000 unspoken hopes. "I have to take it," George said finally, eyes on the pond. "It's what I've worked for." Clara didn't argue. She never did when something truly mattered. Instead, she reached over, took his hand, and held it tightly. "I know," she said, and that was that. They didn't fight. They didn't cry. But something changed that day. The bench became quieter, their laughter more tentative, every goodbye heavier. George thought, at times, of asking her to wait, of making some kind of plan, but he couldn't. It didn't feel fair. She had dreams, too, a life to build, and he couldn't promise he'd be back. Not soon, maybe not at all. So, he made the choice. He boarded the plane that August, with her letter in his pocket, one she'd slipped to him at the train station, sealed with a kiss and a line that read, "No matter where you go, I'm proud of you." He didn't open it until weeks later, when the homesickness set in, when the sound of her voice in memory was the only thing that made the cold mornings bearable. She had written, "You were always meant for big things, George. I just hope, somewhere in them, you remember the little things too, like strawberry sodas, and Thursdays, and me." The fellowship was everything he thought it would be: challenging, exhilarating, prestigious. He walked ancient corridors, sat in rooms with scholars whose books he'd once studied, and saw places he'd only dreamed about. But in every joy there was an echo, a quiet wondering. Would Clara have liked this cafe by the river? Would she have laughed at the professor who always wore mismatched socks? Would she have found magic in the rainy cobblestone streets, the way she did in the bookstore back home? He didn't dwell, not openly, but every Thursday, wherever he was, Paris, Edinburgh, Prague, he found a bench. He sat for an hour. He thought of her. Sometimes he wrote letters he never sent. Little updates, thoughts, jokes, lines from books she loved. When he returned home nearly 2 years later, the bench at Linden Park was still there. The trees are taller, the bricks more uneven, but the bench unchanged. He went on a Thursday, of course. Saturday down with a soda and a prayer. She didn't come. He hadn't expected her to, but some part of him still watched the path, just in case. Later that week, he asked a mutual friend. Clara had moved. A job in another city. A new chapter. He understood. They crossed paths only once more. Years later, at a conference, she was giving a talk on community journalism. He sat in the back, heart pounding, hands clammy. She hadn't changed much. Same voice. Same smile. Afterward, she spotted him. They hugged. They talked briefly. No regrets, no what-ifs. Just kindness. Just warmth. He didn't ask if she was happy. She didn't ask if he was alone. Some things didn't need saying. As the years passed, George built a life. a quiet one. Work, books, travel, a niece he adored, friends who checked in. But he never married. Not because he hadn't loved again. He had, in quiet, tender ways, but never like Clara. Never with the same wide-eyed belief that something could be both ordinary and extraordinary all at once. And so, every Thursday, he returned to the bench, not to rewrite the past, but to honor it, because in choosing to go, he hadn't chosen to forget. He had chosen a future, one that would always carry the echo of the sweetest, most beautiful decision. He never truly made the decision not to stay. He would sit there, watching the breeze play through the leaves, and wonder if she ever did the same. If Thursday afternoons ever brought her a pang of memory, a flicker of something sweet. He didn't need the answer. Some loves weren't meant to be recovered. They were meant to be remembered quietly, fully, gratefully. Because love like that didn't demand a conclusion. It asked only to be carried, gently, through the years. And every Thursday, that's what George did. He carried it. He had let her go, not because he loved her less, but because he believed love could endure even from afar. And it had. In the pages of memory. In the rhythm of Thursdays. In the quiet, undying way of the heart. There's a peculiar kind of peace that comes not from having everything, but from understanding what you once had and why it mattered. George's life after Clara wasn't tragic. It wasn't lonely in the way most people imagine. It was full in its own quiet way. There were colleagues who became friends, books that shaped him, places that welcomed him. There was even a cat once, a moody tabby named Milton, who ignored everyone but George. He taught, he traveled, he read. He built a life of meaning, though never one of noise. And every Thursday, no matter where he was, he sat on a bench and thought of her. Not with pain, at least, not after the first few years, but with a soft ache, like the last note of a favorite song that fades too quickly. Clara had married. He knew this from a friend's postcard. She'd stayed in journalism, moved to a coastal town, and later had a daughter. George imagined her in a little house with blue shutters and wild roses climbing the fence, her voice still strong, her laughter unchanged. He never saw photos, never searched her name. Some part of him wanted to keep her where she was in memory, untouched by the erosion of time. He dated occasionally, fell in love once or twice, but nothing settled, nothing stayed. His friends would tease. Still holding out for the one that got away? He would smile. Maybe just holding space for the one that got me. Because Clara had. Not just in the way young love does all fire and infatuation, but in the way real connection does. Quiet, steady, unforgettable. He thought of her when it rained, when a certain line from a novel resurfaced, when someone laughed like she did, when the wind moved through trees just so. It wasn't longing, it was presence. She was woven into the fabric of his being not as a ghost, but as a guide. When his mother passed, George went straight to the park. He sat on their bench for hours, letting grief move through him like a river. He imagined what Clara would say. Something kind, something grounding. And for a moment, he didn't feel quite so alone. He never built a family of his own, but he became Uncle George, to many the one who remembered birthdays, who read poetry at weddings, who brought the best pie to Thanksgiving. He gave what he could, and every Thursday he refilled his heart in that small act of return, to the bench, to the memory, to the version of himself that had once believed in forever. Once, while traveling through Lisbon for a conference, George stumbled upon a small music shop tucked into an alley. It was playing a familiar tune, an old jazz record Clara once played on her dorm room turntable. He stepped inside, stayed for an hour, and bought the vinyl, though he no longer had a record player. Some memories, he decided, deserve a home even if you can't play them. Years later, when Clara's name appeared in a newspaper article, an award for investigative work, he clipped it and tucked it into the same book where her engagement photo once lived. She'd done well. Of course she had. George didn't cry when he read about her retirement. He simply closed his eyes and smiled. In his own quiet way, he kept living. He mentored students who became writers, historians, teachers. He tended his garden with a devotion Clara would have teased him for. He made time for music, for walking, for wondering. And yet, there was always the bench. The town changed. New playgrounds, new signs, trees trimmed, but the bench remained. People came and went, couples, children, joggers. Some would nod to George, recognizing him as a fixture, like the statue near the fountain or the ducks by the pond. One spring, a young woman sat beside him. She reminded him of Clara, not in looks, but in spirit. She had a notebook and a restless energy. She asked what he was reading. They talked. She returned the next week, then the next. She called him her bench friend, told him about her job, her fears, her dreams. He listened, encouraged, offered stories in return. Before moving to a new city, she left him a letter. "You reminded me that love doesn't have to end to be real." He kept that one too. It was in these small moments, the unexpected connections, the kindness shared between strangers, that George saw the shape of his life. Not a straight line, not a story of loss, but of return, of remembrance, of a man who had loved deeply and kept loving in the echoes of that first, perfect melody. Every Thursday, he returned. Saturday down slowly, took out a thermos, opened a book, and let the silence sit beside him like an old friend. He didn't need to chase what could have been, because what had been was already enough. Sometimes, sitting there with his hands folded and his gaze on the pond, he would imagine her voice soft, teasing, wise. She'd tell him he was doing just fine, that he'd built something gentle, that he had honored their story with every Thursday he returned. And George believed her. He didn't come to the bench to relive what was. He came to live what remained. The warmth, the memory, the truth that once in his life he'd been seen, known, and cherished completely. And in the quiet that followed, George finally understood. The echoes of what could have been weren't painful anymore. They were music. They were home. He stayed until the light changed, until the bench was cool beneath him, and then he stood, tipped his hat to the sky, and walked home, leaving behind not sorrow, but something sacred. Love remembered. The Thursday George brought the letter felt different. The sky was a little bluer, the wind a little softer. Even the ducks on the pond moved more slowly, as if sensing something sacred was about to unfold. He carried no thermos that day, no bread roll, just a single envelope, yellowed with time, tucked carefully into the inside pocket of his coat. He had written it decades ago, in the small hours of a sleepless night overseas. His handwriting was younger than surer, a little rushed. he hadn't sent it. Not because he didn't mean the words, but because he didn't know what they would do. Words had power, and some truths, once spoken, asked too much. But now, in the quiet hush of the park, George felt ready. Or maybe, finally, the letter was. He eased onto the bench and unfolded the paper with hands that trembled only slightly. Then, softly, he began to read. Dear Clara, it's raining here tonight. The kind of rain that reminds me of home soft, steady, patient. I thought of you as I watched it slide down the window pane, how you used to trace hearts in the condensation and pretend not to see me watching you. I miss you. I know I haven't said that not out loud, but it's the truth that echoes through everything I do. I carry you in the sound of train whistles, in the smell of rain, in every time I see someone throw their head back when they laugh. You've shaped me. More than anyone. I don't regret coming here. I think I was meant to. But I do regret not finding the words to ask you to stay, or to wait, or to follow. Maybe I thought I was being noble. Maybe I was scared. Or maybe I just didn't want to risk breaking the one perfect thing we had by stretching it across too much time. But oh, Clara, if I could do it again, I wouldn't hesitate to risk it. You once asked me if I believed in soulmates. I laughed, remember? Said I believed in good timing and mutual respect. But the truth is, I believed in you. And if that's not the same thing, I don't know what is. I don't know where you are right now. I don't know who holds your hand, or if your dreams ever looked like mine. But I hope more than anything that you are loved, that you are laughing, that you are safe. And if, by some grace, you think of me, I hope you smile. Always yours, George. George folded the letter slowly, pressing it back into the envelope. He didn't cry. The tears had come and gone over the years, in moments far quieter and lonelier than this. Today, he felt something different, something softer. Release. He sat for a while, letting the silence settle. The bench beneath him was warm from the sun, the air still with memory. In his pocket was a second envelope, blank on the outside. He pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a small paper boat, folded carefully from a page torn from one of Clara's favorite books. He had practiced the fold over and over until it looked just right. He stood, walked to the edge of the pond, and placed the letter, Clara's letter, inside the boat. It floated gently, then drifted outward, catching the light like a message whispered across time. For a moment, George watched it. Then he turned back to the bench and sat again. He remembered their first kiss, her favorite scarf. The time she made him laugh so hard, he spilled soda all over his notes. He remembered her voice. Saying his name like it mattered more than anything else in the world. And he remembered how he had never stopped loving her. Not in the desperate way of youth, but in the faithful way of time. A love that aged gracefully, that asked for nothing in return, that simply remained. For years, the letter had been too heavy to send. But now, it felt like a feather. Light, true, free. People walked by. Children laughed near the swings. Somewhere a dog barked, and someone sang softly to themselves. And George Old, steady George, sat with a heart wide open. He thought of the thousands of Thursdays he had spent on this bench, each one a thread, woven into a tapestry of memory and meaning. Each one a quiet promise. I remember. I returned. And now, he had given her the last of what he'd held. A letter. A love. A goodbye that didn't ache anymore. Only one page remained in his pocket blank, except for a line he had written that morning. To remember you was never hard, but to let go, that took everything. He smiled, folded it again, and placed it inside the book she had once gifted him. The one with notes in the margins and underlined quotes. He traced one now, with his finger. It read, "What is remembered, lives." And she did. She always had. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in rose and gold, George leaned back and closed his eyes. He could almost hear her, not a memory, not an echo, but something more present. A presence. Not beside him, but within him. She had been the start of everything. And even though their story hadn't followed a straight line, it had never truly ended. He thought of all the versions of himself who had sat here over the years. The boy with stars in his eyes. The man with the world at his feet. The teacher, the friend, the one who had waited, watched, wondered. Each version had loved her. Each one had needed this bench. He opened his eyes and looked around one last time. The pond shimmered. The trees whispered. And in the distance, a small boat bobbed gently on the water, still holding its letter. He knew it would sink soon, and that was okay. Some love is meant to float for a while before resting at the bottom of a story. He stood slowly, knees aching, and picked up his hat. Gave the bench a gentle pat. Then he walked down the path, steady and sure, his shadow stretching long behind him. He didn't look back, not because he was leaving her behind, but because he was finally carrying her forward. In every step, in every word, in every quiet moment of grace. This Thursday had been different, but it too had been hers, and always would be. George didn't return to the bench the next Thursday, not because he forgot, not because the routine no longer mattered, but because, somehow, that final visit had closed a circle. Instead, he walked along the edge of the pond, hands in his pockets, heart full. He paused near the maple tree, looked toward the bench from a distance, and smiled. He had said everything he needed to say. The letter had been more than paper and ink. It had been a door, one he had finally opened after a lifetime of standing outside. And what he found on the other side wasn't regret or sadness. It was peace. George had spent his life holding on gently, not clinging, but honoring. He had carried Clara's voice through decades of quiet joys and sorrows. And now, with that letter floating into memory, he felt something shift. He hadn't lost her. He had lived her. In kindness offered to strangers, in stories shared with students, in the way he brewed tea, in the way he folded his shirts, in the way he sat still and listened. That, he realized, was the legacy of love. Not the dramatic declarations or the photographs, but the daily rituals, the gentle echoes. He found new rhythms. Some Thursdays, he still walked to the park, sat on a different bench, and read. Sometimes he stayed home, wrote letters to people he hadn't spoken to in years. Once, he read a poem aloud to a group at the library, and didn't stutter once. One winter afternoon, Clara's daughter visited. She had heard about George, from her mother, from friends, from the way a name lingers in a house long after the stories stop. They drank tea, talked softly. She showed him a photo Clara, in her later years, holding a book he had once given her. She kept it by her bed, the daughter said. Said it reminded her of someone who once knew her completely. George didn't speak right away. He only nodded. Eyes misted. Heart open. That night, he sat at his desk and wrote one last letter. Not to Clara. To himself. He wrote of love and memory. Of how some people pass through your life and never leave. Of how it's possible to let go without losing. To grieve without breaking. And most of all, to remember with joy. He ended the letter with a line that came to him quietly, like a whisper. You did well, old man. You loved without needing to hold, and that is the rarest kind. Note: George sealed the envelope and placed it in a small wooden box beside his favorite chair. Not to send, not to forget, but simply to know it was written. He found, in those final chapters of his life, that presence mattered more than plans, that joy could live beside sorrow, that endings weren't really endings, they were simply softer beginnings. Each morning he walked slower, breathed deeper, noticed more. The world, he saw, was full of reminders. A couple arguing gently at the coffee shop, two teens holding hands under a lamppost, an old woman humming as she knit on a bench. All of them stories, all of them sacred. He watched people and wondered who they had loved, who they had lost, what bench they might one day return to in their hearts. One spring day, George planted a tree. It stood near the path that curved toward the bench. A sapling now, but one day it would offer shade to someone else, someone who needed a place to sit and remember. He placed a small plaque beneath the roots. For Clara, in every Thursday. Years passed. Seasons turned. George's hair thinned, his steps slowed, but the clarity in his eyes remained. He never became a great writer, never traveled the world again. But he did write small pieces, gentle essays, short letters tucked into books he left in little free libraries. He always signed them the same way. Someone once loved me very well. In time, the town came to know the bench. People began calling it the love seat. Couples carved initials nearby. A local paper wrote a story. A little girl left a drawing of two people sipping soda with a heart between them. George never claimed it, never corrected the tales, because the truth was bigger than fact. It was love, and love, he knew, didn't need to be loud to last. In his final season, George returned to the bench one last time. It was a warm Thursday in late summer, the kind where the breeze carried laughter and everything smelled faintly of sun-warmed leaves. He brought a blanket, a book, and a strawberry soda. He sipped slowly, closed his eyes, and listened to the birds, to the children, to the hum of the world still spinning with beauty. He didn't need anything else. He had said his truths, lived his days with intention, held his love gently, and let it become something bigger than memory. He stayed until the light changed. Then, with a soft breath and a grateful heart, he whispered to the world, to Clara, to himself, I loved, and I was loved. What more could anyone want? And in that he found forever. The bench still stands, and somewhere, between the breeze and the branches, the story continues. Not in pages, but in hearts, and in Thursdays. And if one day someone finds that bench, sits quietly, and feels something they can't explain, they'll know. Love lived here, and it still does. The park changes, faces come and go, but the bench remains. And sometimes, if you walk past it on a Thursday, you might notice something: the scent of strawberry, the whisper of a name, the stillness of something sacred. You won't see George, but you'll feel him, because some love leaves footprints, and some footprints never fade. He is still there, always. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you once loved, or someone you still do, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. There are more quiet stories to tell, more benches, more Thursdays, and we'd love for you to be part of them.